I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week we're looking at my picks from 6 to 2 of some of the best documentaries of the decade. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade. Essentially how the series works is every 3 weeks there's a new genre where I give my top 10 picks of my favorite movies of the decade within a certain genre. We've already done action, adventure, romance, sci-fi, fantasy, and now we're on documentaries. So that means the first episode was my 10 to 7 picks, this episode was my 6 to 2, and next week I'm going to be doing a sole video on what I think is the best documentary of the decade. So without further ado, my number 6 pick is Dawson City, Frozen Time. I saw this one in preparation for this list and was totally blown away. Where most documentaries look at a subject, this one looks at a place, and more specifically, a place over time. Like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez book in a lot of ways, because it looks at how the city, Dawson City and Yukon, has transformed over its years. But it wouldn't be on this list if it was just a documentation of a city and its sort of rise to ascendance and fall to mediocrity. But instead, what the film is great in, what has happened, is this narrative through line that we're able to follow, which is this connection of film to the city. Approximately 75% of all silent film is lost. So there's a huge portion of film history that we'll just never know about. And the way the film industry worked back then was film prints would go essentially from city to city, bigger cities going to smaller cities until there was a last stop. Dawson City being the last stop or one of the last stops. So instead, when the theater owners wanted to send it off to the next city, there was no next city to send it to. So they always asked, should we send it back? The studios never wanted them back. So oftentimes they either burned them or they just stored them. And thankfully there was some that were just stored, and we see throughout the film how that evolves and where they go and how they eventually get uncovered again. And that is an interesting part, and as a film lover you definitely like that because it's an interesting through line, but also it works on a totally different element, which is it's not just a film documentary. It really is a documentary of a city, of a place and its people and its transformation. And it's amazing how it's able to capture this 100-year history really in this sort of small documentary with making it feel realized and really giving it a life. Starting off as a mining town for gold and really sort of being built up, and then sort of the mass exodus that happens. Similar in a lot of ways to another documentary that didn't make this list about a town, Bisbee 17, about how an event can affect them so greatly, and then a generation later it's almost completely forgotten about that. Something can happen so impactful and then it can go away just as easily. So on one hand, we have this interesting sort of rise and fall of a city and of an identity, and that's all these sort of somberness and melancholy that sort of brings, and how it's told. It's really a great documentary in itself, and that's on that one hand. But then on the other hand, we're also seeing a lot of this silent film that was retrieved, which was restored for the very first time. So the montages and the clips and with the voiceover narration, we're seeing a lot of these brilliant films or images that we've never seen before, that no one's seen in 100 years, and we're seeing even photography and footage of that area in Dawson City to make it even more grounded and to really understand it even to a further level. So it works on sort of that film lovers and film history kind of an aspect that connects with me personally. But of course I think it also works as this city, and using the subject as a city for the documentary is interesting, because if you think about most documentaries about people, about subjects, about things, rather than an actual place. And I think it works really well for that, and really sort of connected with me on an emotional level and an intellectual level. My next pick is Three Identical Strangers.
A lot of powerful people who would like to have the story silenced.
There's still so much that we don't know.
It boggles the mind.
It's a mystery.
I'd like to know the truth.
What a story, similar to The Imposter, except not a true crime where it's entertaining, it's thrilling, you never know what's going to happen, but it's an incredible story and you're always engaged, and you commend the filmmaker for taking you on this great journey. But if you don't know, Three Identical Strangers is about three identical twins who are separated at birth, who in college eventually find out about each other and reconvene. But that's sort of the one fascination of the documentary. How did this happen? You know, how similar are they? But then as the documentary sort of evolves and unravels, there are more twists and turns you really don't see coming. And really, when that sort of final twist, I guess, happens, it becomes the shock of the decade for me, and I was totally blown away. Because we start to ask these questions, wow, this is a crazy situation, but wait, why were they separated? What happened? How similar are these guys really? Because they're, you know, are they more connected with blood, or are they more separated in that sense? Very interesting. And this is maybe one of the easiest documentaries on the list for me to recommend, because it's a film that's very easy to watch. It fills that sort of traditional narrative and structure of a documentary with the talking heads, with people just being asked and telling their story from different perspectives. But of course, it's a very interesting story. You tell these people about the story and you say, oh, I highly recommend. You never know what's going to happen. I think that's a type of documentary that I connect to, and I think a lot of people connect to, and this was my favorite of that kind, I guess we'll say. Not to diminish it and say it's lesser or anything, because as much as I want the documentary form to expand, I sort of like this format a lot, and ultimately it is a genre, so this is a great genre type of documentary. And the reason why I picked this versus other interesting stories is the way it was told, the way we sort of slowly get to know more information, how it's slowly revealed and twists and turns, and at one point you're totally convinced that you think this is what happened, and then another piece of information is revealed that maybe contradicts what your previous thought is, and now you have to sort of rechange your mind and then sort of go back and forth, and you never know maybe what exactly happened until you do. And then it brings up a whole host of philosophical and ethical and thematic issues that I don't want to spoil, because I highly recommend it, and it's on Netflix and services like that. So it has this interesting story, and it talks about some of the sort of more larger macro sort of themes of what that means, but then also what I think it does well to ground it is to keep some of the familial bond. Just that central question, as these guys have been away from each other, separated at birth, they don't know each other, but they look identical, they have same blood, but do they experience some of the same issues? How much is genetics being passed down? Is it spread evenly between everyone? How much do their families that they were raised by impact them? Is there sort of an overruling thing, sort of a traditional nature versus nurture argument? But the film really keeps you engaged, it keeps you grounded and interested and emotionally connected to these characters, but also the director does a great job at revealing each piece of information so that you're always engaged and entertained. My number 4 pick on this list is Searching for Sugarman.
Next day, he says, Emerson, I gotta go on tour. I said, why is that, Rodriguez? I wonder.
This is really going to be Rodriguez. We'll only know if we can actually sing these songs.
And the best part are still to come.
Thanks for keeping me alive.
A story like no other, and similar to Three Identical Strangers in the sense that it is a really fascinating story, but also related to some other music documentaries. We had Beware of Ginger Baker earlier on this list. I also love other documentaries like Amy, Everybody's Everything, that really explored the musical aspect in the music industry, but this, over all of those, has been my favorite, because the story, if you don't know, is about this American artist who released a couple albums and then weren't commercially successful, and he went on to live his life. However, in South Africa, they were huge. He was huge. He was this massive hit. His albums sold incredibly much. He was seen as, along with the Beatles, as one of the all-time greats. Yet what happened? Why didn't he either receive some of that money and cater his music to South Africa? And what happened to the guy himself? Because he only released these 2 albums, we never got any more albums. The South Africans thought he was this huge thing because they all liked him, not realizing that it wasn't sort of this international phenomenon. And at a time in the 70s, where there's no internet to track people down and to have real-time numbers, he sort of faded into oblivion. So the first half of the documentary is these South African fans who are trying to discover who this guy is, because his name Rodriguez. You don't have like a full name that you can look in a phone book. He lives all the way in America. All these sort of rumors and these myths that build around him, the stories of, oh no, he killed himself, or he died in a car crash. There's all these different stories. That's the first half. But then the second half is actually discovering who this guy is and what happened to him. And the myth of this guy, similar to Drew Baker, with his black glasses and long dark hair, it's almost about sort of talks about, and the theme of the movie is the purity of music in certain ways. How this guy was making music because he loves to make music, and even still after he wasn't with a label and releasing albums, he was still making music, and he still did it for other people and for the purity. And he never even realized that he had this huge success in South Africa. So it's such an entertaining story to figure out what happened to this guy, where did he go, and then also to learn more about this guy as, similar to the Ginger Baker documentary, a mythological figure, as a guy who's so dedicated to the purity of his own art and the mystery that is the man himself. And sometimes I have a hard time describing why a documentary is interesting, because it's similar to the comedies, which we'll be talking about next week, where it's hard to describe why something makes you laugh. Something just makes you laugh. And similar to documentaries, I'm interested in the story. You may not be. I think it's a really fascinating story. So, because on one hand, I'm interested in music and in the music industry and that kind of art. But also, why I think this documentary works and is more successful and connects with me more than other talking head type genre documentaries is because this story could only be told in the documentary format. That, for the same way you would say Alien works of it being a sci-fi movie because it has to be in space, because that there's nowhere to run, no one can hear you scream in space. There's that added extra element that wouldn't be as scary if it were on land in a haunted house. Making it in space makes it inadvertently more scary. Telling this story and the way this goes, it makes it so much interesting and more thrilling, because you know someone didn't write it. You know this wasn't a constructed thriller that you know either the hero's going to get and end up well at the end. You really don't know what's going to happen because it's real life. And this story works so well to the documentary form, which is why I think it is so successful in that. His impact was real. He did make a significant impact in South Africa, and he didn't know about it for many years. So there's this sort of hopeful tragedy that is elevated because of the fact that this is a true story, and not just based on a true story. This is the true story. It is a documentary, and yes, documentaries still are movies, and they're not the exact same thing how they happened, and they can be manipulated, but there is a real connection that you feel with the characters because they're actually there, they're speaking to you, and this is their story. Then my number 3 pick is Jodorowsky's Dune.
Did not do this film because they were afraid of his imagination.
This is a movie that has its fingerprints all over so many other movies. Blade Runner, William Gibson, Matrix.
Giger, he make the monster of Alien, and Hollywood start to use my group.
It always leads back to Jodorowsky.
This film represents, I guess, on my list, the film documentary, because there's been so many documentaries this decade about film and about the filmmakers. I probably could have filled up this whole list with just my favorite film documentaries. I'm thinking of De Palma, I'm thinking of Spielberg, I'm thinking of life itself. But ultimately, I went with Jodorowsky's Dune because at the time when I saw it, I became totally obsessed with it. At one point, I think in a lot of people's film journey, you're really interested in film itself, and the films purely themselves impact you on a really interesting, impactful way. But then there's another stage where you become interested in the filmmaking process and the filmmaking stories. That's why documentaries like Burden of Dreams or Heart of Darkness about Apocalypse Now, they film sometimes about making the film is more interesting than the film itself, or has such a crazy story because all these sort of combination of things collide. And this is what happened, why I became obsessed with Jodorowsky's Dune, was the idea of the film was probably going to be better than the film itself, and because the film wasn't made, we got this great documentary about it, and it's a unique snare that I think would only happen to film. The egos of producers, egos of movie stars, the director who has unlimited power and unlimited control and money, and the sort of collection. And what's great about film is there's the the actors, and then there's the musicians, and then there's sort of the artists and the director, and they all sort of come together to make this singular product. But if you don't know, the story is about Alejandro Jodorowsky, who was a up-and-coming director in the 70s, who his next project he wanted to adapt Dune to the big screen, and he wanted to have Mick Jagger and Pink Floyd do the soundtrack, and he wanted Mick Jagger in the movie, and he wanted David Carradine, and he wanted all these big stars, and he had all these designs and drawings, and he storyboarded the entire film. He has thousands of these drawings of thoughts, of designs and things, of how the story goes out. But the story in the movie never eventually materialized. What happened? Where did it go wrong? What was this grandiose idea would have been as brilliant as Jodorowsky says it is? And that's so much of the film, is that he is so passionate about the film that Jodorowsky is telling you his story. And just, I mean, I could talk about his opinion on art and consumerism and what it means to put yourself in the impact that you have, and how he's so passionate. And you could tell his passion, and you can tell why everyone was so sort of gravitated towards him. You know, you could say that if Dune was the sci-fi Bible for other sci-fi books and sort of the genesis of what we know as sci-fi novels today, you could also say the same for Jodorowsky's Dune for sci-fi movies. This was before Star Wars. This was before Alien. He tapped H.R. Giger, who did the iconic design of Alien, to do designs for his movie. And you can tell sort of these small little pieces that are connected to other sci-fi movies even today, originated by this sort of madman, scientist, genius kind of a character in Jodorowsky. At least how the film portrays him, as this Rosetta Stone for the rest of sci-fi movies. And I'm so compelled to people who are so passionate about their work, and he is completely passionate about it, and he's so fascinating, and you see the how much hard work and how much ambition he has. You can't help but feel so infected in how infectious the movie really is. So if you love film, and if you have a passion for film, this is just totally catnip for you. And it has some of these other elements that I liked of other documentaries, but combined together. It's about film, which I really love, which something like Dawson City Frozen Time has. It has the mythological figure in someone like Ginger Baker, and it has some of the animation of something like Beware of Ginger Baker, that is able to tell a story and propel the story forward. And it's just, on one hand, you feel so completely connected and passionate and towards Alejandro Jodorowsky and his way of telling it, but then you're also so fascinated by the story and the way the film uses animation and real life people talking. It has this great marriage of hearing what it's going to be like, and then seeing what it could have been like, and then wanting to see that next stage of seeing it, but almost, you know, back in the back of your head that seeing it wouldn't have been good as thinking of how good it's going to be. I think it's almost great to be this lost film that never was. I can't wait to see Denis Villeneuve's Dune, but that's going to be completely different. He's going to say more realistic, almost kind of a way, versus Alejandro Jodorowsky's would have been this LSD trip. So it is sort of this lost film that I don't really want to see remade or made at all. It's sort of great being this sort of legend that we'll never see. Then with the second and final documentary we're going to be talking about in this video, my second pick on the list is Senna.
There is a lot to go, a lot to learn, a lot to do, but I have plenty of time.
This represents the sports doc on the list. There's plenty of others, whether it be Icarus or Undefeated, and we also have, you know, I guess the next decade I'm watching The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary on Netflix, which is really tremendous, and I'm always waiting for that next episode. But it also represents the personal documentary of a historical figure. This movie, if you don't know, is about legendary Formula One race car driver Ayrton Senna and his career. It's about an evolution of a man, of, you know, sort of a young kid to becoming a third-year-old adult, about the evolution of the sport and how he changed that sport, and how the technology that's so embedded with the sport constantly evolving, and that pursuit for innovation is just as important as the race car driver in the seat. I think Formula One, as we've seen with something like Ford v Ferrari or Rush, is a great sport to see on film, because we have these sort of engineers and the technicians and that sort of montage process, and then the actual race itself, where you have to put all this millions of dollars in this engineering excellence into a driver's hands, and making the right move or not making the right move, and risking your life, and just the inherent stakes. The stakes of the race itself are so high because it's $1 million car, $1 million a car, and then there's also the fact that they're going incredibly fast, faster than any human in any car ever, and then also if they make one mistake, they could potentially die or get lit in fire or become seriously injured. And I think some of the race sequences in this, because we have this incredible access to footage, are structured and edited in such a way that are more interesting than Ford v Ferrari. And that has to do with the director, Asif Kapadia. He's a director who, you have to give him a lot of credit for how this film turns out, because this has sort of people's perspectives looking back on it and using the audio and the dialogue, but less so of talking heads. A lot of it is using footage and dialogue from Ayrton and from his competitors, Alain Prost, and at the time, and talking about him or talking about him in real time in the 70s. And there's this incredible massive amount of footage, and it's a long documentary, but what Asif is able to do is sort of push it down, which this easily could have been a mini-series with all these narrative links and things, and push it down into a singular story. And keep it engaging, and keep almost these narratives that are built within the movie that happened in real life, or that were sort of manipulated by the documentary. That could have been, like I said, a 4-part, 8-part miniseries, but what's so great is it's an 8-part miniseries with all the good bits compressed into one bit, and that's why I think it works as a movie and not as a miniseries. There's so much drama in this movie, and it's once again heightened by the fact that it's a real fact, that this was true, this is a true story. There's this great sort of duality also within the film of seeing what Ayrton's almost personal out front persona is versus what his persona was sort of more behind the scenes, and we get a lot of that footage. It's brilliant for its access to footage, but works because of how it's portrayed, how the narratives are built with his rival, because of the nature of the sport itself, and the fascination that comes to bring, and the fascination of the man himself, and how he changes, and how the sport changes, and how he wills it, and his sort of total commitment to excellence and to perfection and to winning. It's a fascinating documentary of this sport, fascinating documentary of this man, and a legendary figure within the Formula One racing community. It works, and I recommend it to more than just sports fans because of the fascinating, almost character study of a man, but not character study in the same way Taxi Driver is, because this is a real-life portrait. We hear him in his own words. We hear him from other people's perspectives. So it works there, just a fascinating, brilliant portrait study, but then also if you're a sports fan, and also that heightened realism of the sport itself and the politics and everything that goes along, and just a total life journey in this movie. It's blew me away from the first time I saw it, and it came out in 2010, and I think this is going to be a documentary people are going to remember for many years to come. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned to next week, where I give my #1 pick on my favorite documentary of the decade. That one came out pretty recently, but it impacted me really greatly. So I can't wait to see you guys see that video and I can talk about it. But until next time, stay tuned.